let's jump into it. So here we're gonna learn about aperture. What is aperture? Aperture is basically for control light that goes through your sensor through the lens. So basically you'll find there's a part of the lens that is able to control the amount. It becomes smaller or even wider. So as you can see, I'm having my lens wide open. So basically that allows more light into the sensor. So sorry for the shakes. So basically that's aperture. So jumping into aperture, we see that aperture controls exposure, of which when you have a wider aperture, you tend to allow more light to get into the sensor. Now that's where you're able now like to balance the photo or in terms of lighting. Or still, the aperture also helps in creating depth in your photo or even your video. So basically when you have a wider aperture and allow more light in, you tend to create a depth in the photo or even in the video. So basically depth is basically like having separation of your subject and the background you have. So you tend to see that you'll see an example here. So when you have a wider aperture, you tend like to have a big separation of the subject to the background, and when you have a smaller aperture, you tend to have a sharper image of which there's minimal light that is allowed in. So you tend to have a sharper image of which you may have a sharper object or subject and also a sharp background. So we tend to see that a wider aperture diffuses the background and the foreground. Take note. So then a smaller aperture brings foreground and background in focus. It's basically what I have said in previously, that when you have a smaller aperture, it tends to sharpen out everything so that you are able to have everything in detail, from the foreground in focus, from the subject in focus, and also the background in focus. So the aperture is mostly denoted as an F number, of which it's called it's basically also for a focal distance, because with the different apertures you tend to have focus at different focal distances. So we'll tend to find that we have different levels of F numbers, from f1.8 up to f22. So these numbers are quite in a mix-up, because it means when you're at f1.8, it's when you're at your widest, and when you're at f22 is when you're at your smallest, which is more of the smaller aperture, even though they are arranged in a inclining way, but it means like you have a smaller aperture when you're at f22, meaning that your image will be most sharpest when you're at f22. So basically that's it for aperture. So we'll go into the next lesson where you'll be able to learn more about shutter speed and everything. So another to be note, so in cinematography is where they have T-stops. So let's jump into the next lesson, which is what is ISO, and keep watching. Thank you for watching. Leave a like and subscribe.